Hi, I'm Leilani Farha, the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to housing. I'm sorry I'm unable to be with you at this really important tenant summit, but I hope that my comments by video message will be well received. As rapporteur, I've been in the position since 2014. My job is to act as a kind of global watchdog on the right to housing. Are people enjoying the right to housing, and are governments doing what they should to ensure people are enjoying the right to housing, what they're obliged to do under international human rights law? I understand that York South-Weston is under tremendous pressure right now, like so many other places in the city of Toronto and across the world. And I understand that you are forming a tenants union this weekend, and that's so very, very important to challenge what's happening to your neighborhood, to your community. There is, in fact, no other way. As I understand it, you have been greatly affected by the purchasing of many units and buildings by Starlight Investments. Starlight is, of course, in institutional partnership with Blackstone. Blackstone is the largest private equity firm in the world, and their business model that Starlight has adopted is to find what they call undervalued properties, purchase them, make some modest renovations and upgrades that may or may not be necessary, and then, where possible, get around laws or use laws in their favor and jack up the rents. And I understand that your community is under this very pressure. I know that Starlight has a real stronghold in Toronto. They own more than, from my count, 180 buildings across the city, and of course in Weston in particular. And I also understand that their modus operandi is to file for above guideline rent increases, and that they have been doing so consistently since they've entered the Toronto market. And obviously that puts so much pressure on tenants who can barely make ends meet at the best of times. I also understand that in some instances they're moving to evict people rather quickly. That is, in fact, part of the investment model. They need to get rid of people in units and increase rents. That's one viable way to increase rents. So it's very deeply disturbing. I do want you to know, and I don't know that this is comforting, but this is a global phenomenon, and what you're experiencing in Weston, people are experiencing in Berlin, in Spain, in Denmark, in the UK, in Ireland. So, this model is unfortunately the norm in so many places, and of course across the United States. So I'm sure that doesn't make you feel that much better, but it helps to make it clear that this is not about, this is certainly not an individual phenomenon. It is absolutely a systemic issue. My sense is that the only way that this is ever going to be challenged is if tenants come together and really push governments to regulate and do the right thing. And so the fact that you all are forming this union is so important. You'll be joining people around the world, including in Berlin and Spain and the other places I mentioned, that are battling this out. And I think you have to, make sure that your focus is, yes, on the landlord, but also on governments, because it's governments that make regulations and that can make regulations. We could, for example, imagine a regulation that there should be no owner of rental accommodation that can have a monopoly in an area, or that can buy up an entire neighborhood or a block of a neighborhood, or that can, there shouldn't be, perhaps we could curb the number of units that owners could have overall in a city, that sort of thing. You know, this is all very new. Starlight Investments didn't exist before 2011, so they really haven't been around that long. And yet, of course, they are. They have something like $30.5 billion of assets under management, that's the value of the assets under management, $30 billion. So this is new. They are big players with big money. And so it's really time for tenants to claim their right to housing that is being undermined by these global actors and these multinationals and these multi-billion-dollar asset management firms. You know, in Canada, the national level government recently adopted legislation where they affirmed that the federal government policy with respect to housing is one that recognizes housing as a fundamental human right as codified in international human rights law. And we have to breathe life into what that means at the local level. You know, the legislation was adopted at the national level and it governs federal policy. But it is the federal government giving money to provinces and municipalities. And so, you know, an argument could be made very easily that when monies flow from the federal government to the provincial and municipal governments, that those monies must be spent in a way that ensures access to adequate housing and ensures the right to adequate housing consistent with the National Housing Strategy Act, this piece of legislation. Also, you should know that anyone exercising government authority does have human rights obligations and must be implementing the right to housing. Toronto just adopted a 10-year rights-based housing strategy. You can use that to encourage City Council to adopt legislation, bylaws, whatever, to regulate actors like Starlight. And so, I mean, these are just some ideas. I'm happy to be in conversation with you going forward. You may know that I have started a global movement called The Shift. It's a global movement to secure the right to housing. And we're trying to show that there are tenants, residents, organizations, city governments, mayors even, that are architects, development organizations, even the members of the private sector who are committed to seeing housing realized as a human right and are committed to housing as a human right rather than housing as a commodity. So I encourage you to go to our website, www.make-the-shift.org, and get to know us a little bit. And as we ramp up, I'll be reaching back out to you in the hopes that we might collaborate in some fashion. So I wish you all the luck in your meeting this weekend, and I can only encourage you to keep challenging what's happening in your community. Thanks so much.